name is James, and I'm part of this Asia Center project in Bangkok. And as you heard also through the interview symbolically, what Asia Center, myself and my colleagues try to do is actually engage in what we call now a form of transnational diplomacy for cross-cutting measures, moving away from the traditional diplomacy that is in the role of diplomats of nation states. So Asia Center, one of its key projects is about advocating for the rights and highlighting the plight of the Rohingya refugees in Southeast Asia in particular. Simply because there's a lot of work, and rightly so, around the challenges in Cox's Bazar. And there's a lot of attention and resources there, and even though that's not enough, but at the same time, if you look at Southeast Asia, there is a kind of a gap that also needs addressing, and particularly in Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand. So I'm very grateful to be here as Care Center's activist in residence. I want to acknowledge the support from the center and Dr. Mohan in particular, and Breeze, who have been supporting me throughout the run-up to the activity. This is one of several activities I'll be involved in the next week or so, and I'm happy to be here to get the workshop session going. For the friend in Wellington, anytime if you can't hear me, just give a shout out, and let's keep this interactive. So I will kind of outline in this short presentation what are the key features surrounding the Rohingya issue. I've been involved in issues around Myanmar for about over 20 years. I first started going into the country in the mid-90s. I used to work for a German political foundation. At that time, there was an EU ban, and those holding German passports were not able to go into the country. Coming from Singapore, being a Southeast Asian and holding a Singapore passport, and given Singapore's own dealing with the military junta then, Singapore was one of the countries that was not blacklisted in terms of getting visas to travel. So I was in a plum position to get visas compared to many other colleagues based all around the world, or in Thailand, which was very much a bridge from which you went into Indochina and Myanmar in particular. So I was able to go get 2 weeks tourist visa, and what I used to do was to run training sessions mostly through the churches, different churches that used to hold these activities for the ethnic minorities. So I used to run capacity building activities. I used to go into the country clean with just a thumb drive, which was a little pen, so that you don't even know that's a thumb drive. And I would arrive in Myanmar, and in those days there were no internet access, so you would just get a laptop or a computer and you print stuff out, and that was the workshop material. I've been going into the country and speaking to people way before the new city Naypyidaw was even built. So that's a kind of network and access to Myanmar that I have. And this was all kind of brought in when the Asia Center was set up some years ago. So what are the key issues? The key issue really is that, and a lot of it is in the news, the Myanmar military has actually undertaken ethnic cleansing. People have called it different things based on their political position, the country's foreign policy, or the organizational standpoint. But most would have stopped by calling it ethnic cleansing or crimes against humanity. But the term genocide has now come to the fore when the fact-finding mission released its report earlier this year. The fact-finding mission went around the world, including they stopped in Bangkok, and I had the opportunity to interact with them over 2 sessions when they were in Bangkok, and also provided them information and feedback. A lot of this went up in how the report was finally formed, and the key people that were targeted were, civilians and also women. And there was this whole language of the other, in terms of the Rohingya and trying to, keep them out. So for genocide to work and to be prosecuted under the ICC, you need to demonstrate genocidal intent. And the fact-finding mission, spending over a year, argued that it had established, or it is able to establish, there was genocidal intent. So what happens now is to find out or to collate further evidences in order that this can actually go for prosecution under the ICC, and that is a different methodology altogether. So Asia Center is part of a range of organizations that are, advocating for the plight of the Rohingya. As I stated into the start, our focus is on Southeast Asia. We want to look at issues in Malaysia, Thailand, and Indonesia, and also critique or support where appropriate the ASEAN response in, providing relief or support for the Rohingya community. Once this is done, then we can also dovetail on Myanmar in particular. So Asia Center has been organizing a range of activities, working in partnership. Most recently, we had a conference, but also we have direct access, to either the supporting organizations or some spokespeople from the Rohingya community in these countries that I mentioned. In particular, we have focused on calling out ASEAN's role, especially the fact that ASEAN governments have this non-interference policy. And because they have this non-interference policy, they actually have given Myanmar a blank check to get away with a lot of the violence that has befallen the Rohingyas. I think what is important for us to note as far as ASEAN is concerned is the rhetoric has now slightly changed. Since about a few weeks ago, the Singapore authorities who are chairing presently have said that they want to hold Myanmar accountable. So that's the first thing they have said. How they're going to hold Myanmar accountable is not clear. So, but ASEAN has made that rhetoric. But soon after, just a week ago, they also have come up to say they have set up a task force, and the purpose of the task force is to repatriate the Rohingyas refugees back to Myanmar. And if you are looking at Southeast Asian countries, then Malaysia is going to become interesting because most of them are presently, marooned, so to speak, in Malaysia. So in terms of numbers, if you can just look at the map, you can see, and this is not something that comes out very often, so you will see there are a fair bit of numbers in Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, UAE. Of course, Bangladesh has the most number there. And then you have India, 40,000. There's also, some numbers there in Assam. I'll be undertaking a mission in early December to speak with people there in terms of, what the landscape looks like. If you look at the numbers in Myanmar, since the exodus, the number of Rohingyas in Myanmar is drastically reduced, and there's also internal displacement. So that's interesting to see how much of them are still, left in Rakhine State or in other parts, such as Yangon and elsewhere. Thailand has about 5,000. Indonesia has about 1,000, but the numbers are slowly trickling up because there are boats that are coming informally, usually down to Aceh. So, and Malaysia, you have over 100,000. About over 77,000 have been registered by the UNHCR, and you know, community estimates put those who are unregistered to 30,000 and up. So, you know, pushing it in excess of 100,000. So you will note none of these countries are party to the Refugee Convention. So that's a big problem because the refugees then do not have rights. Most often, you know, they don't get asylum status, and even if they are registered by the UNHCR, they don't have rights to work or have access to healthcare, education, or employment. Many of them end up in detention centers and are subject to or targeted by policing authorities. A lot of agencies have, you know, called out for justice from outside ASEAN, and I guess that's where this project is. I think more, you know, calls out need to be made by this part of the world, Asia Pacific and region. Although this is positioned as the Southeast Asia or ASEAN project simply because of the states that are, you know, members to ASEAN, but I think, you know, engaging in the larger Asia Pacific community is also relevant. This is why, you know, I'm here in New Zealand thanks to CARE and to see if there's opportunities to work together with CARE. I've also reached out to some of the stakeholders, political parties and universities also in Wellington and NGOs to see if there could be some interaction or connection also together. In my trip to Australia, I also had a chance to go to Canberra and speak to some of the senators just to kind of set them up to say that as this project advances, we will be able to do parliamentary briefings. We also want to be able to do such briefings to, you know, all three countries that we've highlighted earlier also have national human rights commissions or institutions, and we can do briefings there and also, you know, interact with the parliament. So what you see here now is a range of international institutions, global institutions that have taken up the issue, but we note there is a gap that from the Asia Pacific region or at the ASEAN level, that's not enough advocacy, and I think this is what we are trying to kind of construct in our project moving forward. So looking at a more regional focus, ASEAN has the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission of Human Rights, but it's not performing its function. It's weak. A lot of the representatives are state diplomats, and again, you know, there's not enough voice lent to the Rohingya plight, and that's why we are taking a more non-traditional approach to diplomacy and having alternative non-state actors to raise the voice in the ASEAN context. So why is ASEAN? Yes, sure.
In previous slide, you have progressives have regressed into authoritarianism. What do you mean by that?
Was this one here?
Yeah.
Oh, this is just to state that a range of countries that were seen as progressive, such as the Philippines and Thailand, and the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights, its structure is not robust. So a lot of its progressiveness is also seen to be empowered in the volition or the actions of the representatives. So up to 2 or 3 cycles ago, representatives from Thailand and the Philippines who came from a robust political system had sort of a democratic way of selecting its representatives. So you will find that out of the 10 representatives, representative from Thailand, Malaysia, Philippines, and Indonesia were always strong, and you could lobby them on issues. But now you find out of the 4, 2 have been taken away. The only one that's robust really is Indonesia and Malaysia. Thailand to some extent okay, because that person came in just before the junta came into power, but we don't know who the next representative is going to be. And Philippines has been very much a bit of a washout. So that's, there's a slight back, so we couldn't even depend on the individual agency of the representatives. So a lot of why, ASEAN doesn't want to raise its voice is because, they want to benefit from the extraction economy of Myanmar, whether it's energy, services, large industrial projects. Everybody is there doing deals, right? If you get into Yangon now, you get into Naypyidaw now, everybody wants to have a first mover advantage. So in that climate, then politics and, speaking up gets pushed into the margin. There's also regional politics. So PRC, India, Japan are competing for influence. I have had extensive discussion with the Japanese counterparts, including visiting them in the embassies in Myanmar. They are at wit's end. They will tell you it's difficult in Japanese musokashi, and they rather kind of sit on the edge, so there's no progressive action. The Chinese diplomats, they go around, and attend meetings about business and economics, and they do not participate in other type of meetings that involve politics or the discussion of the plight of the Rohingya. So because of the geopolitical tensions or movements around Myanmar, you find these 3 powers also part of the problem. And for India, you have that whole northeast region that is concerned about. I'm not still quite clear, so that's why I'm making a trip to Assam to discuss with possible partners and informers about what's happening there on the ground. And with China, of course, we always have to bear that it has its own backyard in the west with Xinjiang province, and they don't want the Muslim Islamic related ethnic issue to also spill over, so that's why they take a hard stance as well. China always insists that this problem should not become international. So we have also challenges of advocacy because most of the funding for human rights advocacy comes from the West. That in itself is not a bad thing, but you will find there will be some political positioning, just like we saw in the area of PRC, India, and Japan as well. So whether it's Amnesty International that has constant conversations with the British office, Home Office, or Human Rights Watch, also with the State Department. So these things color the legitimacy, the ethics, the morality of those kinds of advocacy. And I know this firsthand because I served as the regional director for Amnesty International based in Bangkok. And numerous meetings with London and the British Embassy around this issue. There are also challenges around regional organizations as well. A lot of them adopt the methodology, which is the naming and shaming methodology. So again, this doesn't work very well. In the 1 year that I was with Amnesty and chairing, I chaired for 6 months the the coordination committee of the Rohingya crisis for global amnesty. And I could see that it became all about being first to release some damning information and getting media highlights. But I found that it was not effective in terms of engaging with the issue and talking to your audience. Because at the end of the day, the people that you need to engage with, you need to have a dialogue. You can't just shout at them. So when I went to lead amnesty delegations to Myanmar, it was very, very difficult because the generals, the ministers will switch off immediately. And you can't have a conversation with them. So I think you need to have a different methodology without compromising principles. And one way is to have something that comes out naturally from the ground that may not have direct connection with some of the older brands in advocacy, so to speak. For the regional groups, a lot of them are limited by sources of funding because fundraising for activities from the region is still very thin. People don't easily give money for political causes and definitely not for refugee causes. So this is a bit of a challenge. So how do you do more for less? And if you can get it from the Asia Pacific region, yeah. I found also international agencies also, because they are answering to governments, they don't have the edge to speak out. Every piece of document is extremely watered down, and people tend to be careerists and do not take risk, and they will only put out statements and work on issues that will be well received. And there are also interagency rivalries. In the public domain, you will have, for example, in Cox's Bazar, the rivalry between IOM, the migration organization, as well as UNHCR, to see who will get the funding and who will have jurisdictions and so on. Very sensitive, very complicated type of landscape to navigate. So as a result, we feel that if you're not part of this, perhaps there is something that one can contribute meaningfully. So, but that remains to be seen, but at least that's the ambition here. Then, of course, we cannot rule out Bangladesh. We have strong connections with Bangladesh and the Bangladesh embassy in Thailand, Bangkok. The ambassador has come to the Asia Center many times and given briefings, sometimes at our request, sometimes she had new information to share. But at the same time, we know Bangladesh is also politically active. They have an election at the end of the year, so the dynamics of the Awami League and the BNP politics also to some extent shapes the discourse around the Rohingya issue, and that's something that we need to watch in the next few months. Incidentally, the Bangladesh ambassador in Thailand just finished a term and she'll move on to the UK. So I think it's an interesting posting to, because UK is quite active in lobbying for this cause. So, so where Asia Center is, and Asia Center is not working alone. It's got partners in all these countries, both NGOs that are providing service and humanitarian support to the affected communities. We also have access to the human rights commissions and also parliaments. So we are hoping that we can undertake collaborative and participatory research on what is affecting the community and how these three states can contribute. And one advocacy point is really to get them to rectify the convention. and also support and largely also to call out this ASEAN strategy and monitor it from the ground up perspective. The two other countries that are supportive of what's happening there is Australia and New Zealand. They have given out aid. The refugee quota, well, more can be done. I mean, New Zealand has doubled up, but still I think more can be done in other areas as well. So part of our work is to kind of lobby friends and supporters from these two countries to get on board with the project. So to do evidence-based, participatory research, and then have a series of activities and to do high-level advocacy and to put some pressure. So speaking to Parliament, speaking to ASEAN level reps, talking to the National Human Rights Institution, and also having, community or public activities as part of that. Yeah. So thank you very much.
Can we take some questions?
Yeah, sure. Hey, Wellington.
Hey.
Kelsey, hi.
Hi.
Do you have any questions?
Or just a reaction, yeah.
Before Wilhelm came to Wellington and gave not the same presentation, but talking about similar things. And for myself, I'm researching the conflict in Palestine, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And so for me, I was curious about how the efforts that were being made in CARE, how those efforts could be, how they could be used to address other conflicts around the world, to create the same kind of attitude toward advocacy for those groups that are being marginalized, displaced, or the victims of. Yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
I guess that's more a question for you.
Yeah.
Yeah, please. I'm interested.
Maybe thanks Kelsey for that question. Before I respond to that, maybe James, you can talk about what role can an academic center that is research driven like CARE play within the context of a crisis like this and the work of advocacy?
Yeah, I think a specialist organization, research organization can help by actually getting involved in the research. And I think that's the first support. And also to understand that this research is action research. That means there's a certain outcome we want to achieve. And what I like about the CARE approach is really your own brand of participatory research, which is very, very much community-centered, and also including community leaders or researchers in that role. So that's a level of depth that we have not used. So I welcome to be enriched by that as one strategy. But of course, to then at the end of the research to have the clear recommendation points. I think where we can add to something like CARE, and this is what is exciting, is that whole, you got to walk in the recommendation. So it's not enough just to kind of have it published and articulated, whether through media or through our standard publication portals. I think we need to take it to the stakeholders, which is a meet and greet, shaking hands, pushing the rhetoric, going to their platforms. Let's say, for example, going to Parliament and give a briefing. Not all parliamentarians will turn up for a briefing, but many of their researchers and coordinators would, and that's a great place to influence. And also the national human rights institutions, you can meet all the representatives of the council or the commission and brief them, and then find out if there's a working committee, and then you sort of tap into it and have constant feedback. So I think that's the kind of complementary role, because we know those actors on the ground, and we can walk in the recommendations. So I think that's the relationship. Yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
So I want to build on that, Kelsey, and that's why I asked James to lead this, because I think what he said is exactly then the kind of question that is important for us at CARE to ask. is that how do we do this kind of community-grounded communication infrastructure for the voices of the very disenfranchised, and then translate that into change. So the kinds of lessons and pedagogy that James offers and that Asia Center offers, in terms of actually then taking those recommendations and moving those into spaces of change, I think are really critical. So if you sort of take your question of the Israel-Palestine conflict and really look at, the question of Israeli occupation, how do you then translate these questions of the conflict into bringing dialogic spaces for change? And what might that change look like? I think that really is the critical question,
Right.
James, I want to build on this to ask you, some of the things that you pointed out here, which I think are phenomenal. So one of the things that seems as though is that in terms of the commitment to change process, there are a lot of turf wars and battles of ownership when it comes to international agencies and the ways in which they look at these issues, because an issue like the Rohingya crisis also then gets framed as a challenge for funding,
Yes.
which sort of unfortunately frames the work of international agencies in ways that can be quite extractive and co-optive without really committing to the questions and challenges on the ground. So how do you walk that line, from where you're working, located within Southeast Asia, how do you sort of walk the line between sort of the extractive, colonialist nature of international human rights work and articulating a sense of solidarity which could actually contribute to the work on the ground?
Yeah, I think there's two things. I think one is the political economy of international organizations that's slowly coming up to the fore. Governments from the West have traditionally funded development agencies, and development agencies have generally been involved in re-granting. So a lot of the implementation work were taken by, organizations on the ground that we know as NGOs or civil society. This includes also, refugee groups, advocacy groups, human rights groups, and so on. Now, what has happened, because these traditional countries are also having economic challenges, the amount of money given to let's say the donor agencies. I'll give a very specific example. Let's pick up Netherlands that gives generously, and they have a citizenry that's committed to giving, especially for political causes. So the Netherlands state used to give HIVOS, the development agency, substantial grants, and HIVOS then becomes re-granting agencies and has been doing so for many, many years. But since 2015, the volume of funds, government funds that HIVOS received has been drastically reduced. So HIVOS now does not do too much in terms of re-granting. Itself becomes the implementer. So that's the challenge. So what happens is those implementing agencies then either shrivel out, or if they are not entrepreneurial, and I will unpack that shortly, may actually go out of business, so to speak, because that work is now directly implemented by. I'll give you two other examples. Canada decided not to proceed with the Canadian International Development Agency. So CIDA, as we know, Canadian CIDA is now closed. So they have other versions of it, but basically with less money. The Open Society, the George Soros Foundation, has also done an innovation. They have started their own NGO, which is directly funded, called the Open Justice Initiative. So these now, representative of these agencies now come to the region to find out what other NGOs are doing, what is their area of work, because they have the access to the funding where NGOs, are unable to do so. And I'll end up by a last example, something called the Border Consortium. They used to do a fair bit of work on the north of Thailand, especially around Myanmar refugees, but of the Karens because of the borderline there. And because of the Rohingya crisis and other issues, Palestine, Syria in particular, a lot of the funds has disappeared. So the Border Consortium eventually has to close down, right? Because there's no funds. So in this context, I think how do we operate, and so some agency like Asia Center operates. I think we first of all depend on alternative sources of funding. Asia Center was set up through personal donations and donations from those who believe in the projects to actually set up the agency. And then we also, take a social enterprise model. Asia Center runs a seminar room like this size that we see here, which is located in central Bangkok, and it rents it out to NGOs, universities that come through Bangkok because it's much cheaper than a hotel, and it adds on some, event services and so on, and that's able to generate about 20% of its costs. It's got, a total of 5 staff and others as needed, on a project basis. Asia Center also, applies for funds, but to different agencies and organizations, but these are quite thin. And then we work in partnerships, as implementing agencies. So we use a mesh of approaches in order to run actually what is quite a high impact but a modestly funded entity. So that's the approach, and I think that's the approach of the future. Such organizations really have to explore social enterprise and, of course, need to come from a position of giving. So I think the culture of giving is very much important as, to make it work, yeah.
So I'll just ask one more question before we pray. Really enjoyed that slide on that talked about India, China, sort of being interested in investments, Japan in Myanmar, and the slide on the commercial interests, which also brings up a really interesting point, which is that as I've read some articles that talk about the Rohingya crisis being a product of the rapid neoliberal transformation of Myanmar in terms of these extractive industries coming in and seeking space and space to acquire land, which sort of is exactly what is enabled through the work of the military and through the ethnic cleansing of the Rohingyas. So do you want to talk a little bit about sort of the business and the economic interests that, because it seems like there is an ethnic nature of the conflict, but there is also an economic, colonialist, capitalist nature of the conflict. So is there any sense of how that works, and if there are any political economic underpinnings, how does one address those elements?
Yeah, that's quite a complicated and sophisticated environment simply because we need access. Now, one of the early discourses that came out of the Rohingya crisis was actually the role of China. China actually wanted to have the eastern seaboard of Rakhine State cleared so that it can develop the Kaiku port. And early report, and that's why there was a lot of burning and clearing of the villages. And we have emerging reports that, construction is well underway now. So, but for evidence-based research, we really need access to the ground. And this is where I think, Mohan, you preempted something that was going to raise to you in the next few days. Yes, participatory research is important, but for this kind of areas that we couldn't reach, especially now, if we can do satellite research, and these can be quite expensive, but actually to map and take pictures of that area, before the crisis, during the crisis, immediate post-crisis, and so on, we can actually map out and show aerial photographs to see how the landscape has changed. This is something that Asia Center wants to explore, but because it's an expensive area, and we need additional training in how to read some of these digital photos, and this can then supplement, and make that kind of research very as holistic as possible. Yeah. So because certain methodologies cannot be applied in certain political environments because of restrictions. So of course, they are still not giving permission to travel in the region, but I think publicly exposed international NGOs may have more challenges in getting a visa or permission to travel. But I think if you have academic institution or think tank partners who have been sophisticated in the advocacy, we could work about exploring, ground access in the following months or in the next 1 or 2 years to those kinds of areas to see, So that was just and of course there's the whole business and human rights approach to that. So that's just on Rakhine State and in the port issues. Yeah.
So this question of satellite imaging is very interesting, and I'm completely naive about it. So would you go to like NASA or?
There are private agencies, and of course the human rights organizations use particular agencies that gone through some human rights due diligence. China is also very big on satellite imagery, and they are much cheaper to procure, but they may not meet some of the ethical and human rights standards. CARE is now based here, so it'll be interesting to explore through the New Zealand providers. They could be government or non-governmental providers, or even the university, depending on which department is involved in this area. And we'll need to explore, first of all, one is the technical capacity and ways to achieve it, and then the rights and ethical issues, and then of course the budgetary issues. And there are fascinating things that can be done through this new approach to research. Yeah.